The first thing I remember is the stillness of that room. Dust hung in the light like pale smoke, turning one thin shaft of afternoon sun into a solid column that stopped right at the edge of an old wooden table. Two plates sat there facing each other across the scarred surface rims, chipped silverware lined up just so, like somebody had taken a long time to decide exactly where they belonged. The air was dry and stale the way attics smell when you open them after years, only sharper, like the wood itself had been holding its breath. Somewhere above, a loose shingle tapped against the roof in the wind, soft and irregular, the only sound in a room that felt frozen mid-sentence. A chair waited on one side of the table, pushed in neatly untouched. The one opposite was offset just a few inches, as if someone had once sat there and never pushed it back. On the seat, something bright and red and delicate lay folded, the only color in a room of browns and grays. I remember standing there feeling that thin mountain air scrape my throat, knowing that whatever had happened in that room had happened a long time ago, and that the quiet wasn't peace. It was something heavier, something unfinished. Let me know where you're listening from and hit follow if you think remembering is its own kind of justice. Back then, before any of that, my world was much smaller and a lot more ordinary. I lived in a 2-bedroom condo in Denver, the kind of place where you hear neighbors roll their trash cans to the curb on Tuesday nights and the smell of someone else's dinner creeps under your door if you forget to latch it. My days were concrete and blueprints and email chains. Structural engineering isn't glamorous, but it's steady. The kind of work where you measure twice, check your numbers 3 times, and go home tired in a clean shirt. Most evenings, I'd sit at my kitchen table with a glass of cheap red wine, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, and scroll through whatever photos my little sister had sent that week. Elk at sunrise, storm clouds tangled in a ridgeline, a single yellow leaf caught in the ice along some nameless creek. Through her lens, the wild parts of Colorado felt close enough to touch, even when I was just staring at them on a smudged phone screen with the smell of dishwasher soap in the air. Hannah's life looked very different from mine. At 29, she lived out of a small apartment on the other side of the city, half her gear always packed and stacked by the door lenses wrapped in old flannel shirts, tripod legs sticking out of a faded duffel. When you walked into her place, you smelled coffee, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of dried mud on boots lined up by the wall. The fridge was usually half-empty yogurt apples, leftover takeout, but the shelves in her office nook bowed under the weight of field guides, topo maps, and worn notebooks with dates and locations scrawled down the spines. She made her living selling prints, licensing images, and doing short assignments for magazines that liked her eye for lonely trees and stormlight. It wasn't stable, not the way my job was, but she had this quiet, steady certainty about what she was doing that made it hard to argue with. She used to say she felt more at home above 8,000 feet than she ever did on a city sidewalk. Early that September, the heat in Denver broke almost overnight. One morning, the air that came through my open window had a bite to it, cool dry with that faint, dusty smell you only get when summer finally loosens its grip. That was when Hannah called me about the trip. I remember her voice coming through my phone over the soft hiss of traffic outside my building, bright and focused in a way I'd heard 100 times. "There's a stand of aspens up near Cedar Ridge," she said. "They go gold fast up there, and the light hits them from the side in the late afternoon. It only looks like that for a week, maybe less." She talked about ridge lines and drainage and something about the angle of the sun that I only half followed, flipping a pen between my fingers while the smell of burnt coffee from the office kitchen drifted in. What I heard most wasn't the details. It was that familiar energy under her words, the kind that meant her mind was already there, standing in cold air somewhere with a camera in her hands. Cedar Ridge, if you've never heard of it, is one of those small Colorado towns that seems to be holding its breath between seasons. In the summer, the highway that runs through it fills with RVs and dusty Subarus bikes rattling on racks as people chase trailheads and campgrounds. In winter, it's skiers passing through snow-packed roofs and chains on their tires, stopping just long enough to fill their tanks and grab gas station coffee that smells stronger than it tastes. But in early fall, when the first frosts silver the grass at dawn and the cottonwoods along the river fade from green to yellow, the place quiets down. You can stand outside the diner and hear the river moving behind the buildings, low and steady, like someone breathing in the dark. That in-between time was when Hannah always liked it best. Fewer people, more stillness. She'd been to Cedar Ridge before, but never to the specific ridge she had in mind that year. She'd found it the way she found a lot of things, reading some half-forgotten blog, then cross-checking that against old Forest Service maps and talking to whoever would answer a phone in the Ranger District office. The locals call it Elk Shadow, she told me, laughing softly. There's this narrow path through a gorge, and at the end there's supposed to be an old hunting cabin and a clearing where the light gets trapped in the trees. I remember the way that sounded in my ear, trapped light, like something out of a story rather than a trip plan. I made a face she couldn't see and asked, "Is it safe?" She sighed, not annoyed exactly, just used to that question from me, and I could practically hear her adjusting the strap of a bag that wasn't even on her shoulder yet. "I've hiked tougher trails, Dan. It's 2 days. In and out. I'll have the satellite beacon. I'll check in." Her confidence settled between us the way it always did, warm and firm, and I let myself believe it. We had our routines around her trips. She'd email me the GPS track she intended to follow, the make and license of whatever car she was driving, the name of the motel if she was staying overnight before or after. I'd print it all at work and tack it to the corkboard behind my desk where it hung next to load calculations and construction timelines. Her neat lines and circles cutting across topo lines like some private code. If she was going to be out of service, she'd say so in big clear letters, "No signal until Sunday night. Don't panic." There was always a joke in there somewhere, usually at my expense. I'd respond with half-serious, half-teasing warnings about bears and early snow, and her tendency to push for just one more shot when the light was good. The truth was, I worried more than I said, but I also knew she was careful, methodical even in the way she took risks. Her gear was always checked twice. Batteries charged. Weather forecast memorized like a script. The night before she left, I stopped by her apartment with a six-pack and takeout. Her living room floor was a spread of gear. Bright dry bags, rolled socks, the hard plastic edges of a first aid kit, a small stove that still smelled faintly of fuel. The windows were cracked open to let in the cool air, and a draft moved a strip of map that was taped to the wall, making the paper whisper softly against the plaster. She had her camera bodies laid out on the coffee table, each one with a bit of worn tape labeled for the card that would go inside. On the arm of the couch sat a little red mesh keychain I'd given her years back, one of those cheap souvenirs you grab at a gas station without thinking. She picked it up, turned it between her fingers, and smiled. "You know this thing has been to more places than most people we grew up with," she said. Her laugh filled the room low and easy, and for a moment it pushed back whatever faint unease had been sitting in my chest since she first said the word Elk Shadow. We went over her plans one more time. Leave Denver early Saturday. Drive the 4.5 hours to Cedar Ridge, the last stretch on 2-lane roads, where the asphalt buckles in the heat and the smell of sage and dust comes through your vents. Check into the Aspen Creek Motel, a low L-shaped building with chipped green paint and a neon sign that flickers at the edges. Talk to whoever was at the front desk about local conditions. Buy a few last-minute things in town. Hit the trailhead at first light Sunday, then back to the motel by Monday night or Tuesday morning at the latest. As she talked, she moved through the room, stuffing gear into her pack, testing the weight on her shoulders, her movements fluid and practiced. I watched the way the straps bit into the padded shoulders of her fleece and thought not for the first time that she carried solitude, the way some people carry a purse naturally, like an extension of herself. I almost said something then. I almost told her that September felt a little different that year, that the cool in the air had come on too fast, that the way the clouds stacked up over the foothills on my commute that morning had put a thin edge in my stomach. But those are the kinds of thoughts you keep to yourself, especially with someone who hates being second-guessed. Instead, I picked up her satellite messenger from the table, felt the smooth, cold plastic in my hand, and asked if she'd tested it. Twice, she said, taking it from me, the little screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the living room. She clipped it to the strap of her pack with a soft click that sounded final in the quiet. I told her to text me when she hit town. She rolled her eyes, but she smiled when she did it. Saturday morning came with that pale, washed-out kind of sun you get before the sky decides what it's doing. I watched from my balcony as the city slowly came to life. Delivery trucks hissing at the curb, the low murmur of a radio from a car passing by, the smell of someone's bacon drifting up from the units below. She sent me a quick photo just after 7, the highway stretching out ahead of her, cracked white lines a smear of mountains in the distance. Coffee in the cup holder, her fingers wrapped around the steering wheel. On the road, the caption read. I stared at the picture a little longer than I meant to, noticing a faint reflection of her face in the windshield eyes, focused mouth set in that slight, almost smile she got when she was concentrating. I texted back, "Drive safe. Remember, some of us are boring and want you around." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. A minute later, "Relax, Dan. It's just another weekend." I went about my day like I always did. Grocery store laundry, a run along the river trail where the cottonwood leaves were just starting to rustle with a different kind of sound, drier, more brittle. The water smelled colder somehow, even though I knew that was impossible. At home, I folded shirts, still warm from the dryer, and let a football game play low on the TV without really watching it. Every so often, I'd check my phone more from habit than real worry, and there'd be nothing new, just the usual notifications, a work email that could wait a weather alert about a slight drop in overnight temperatures in the mountains. By late afternoon, the sun angled in through my living room window, turning the dust in the air golden, so much like the kind of light Hannah chased that I caught myself lifting my phone as if I might capture it and send it to her. I didn't. I just stood there and watched it move across the wall until it faded. She texted me once more from Cedar Ridge. A snapshot of the Aspen Creek Motel sign buzzing faintly against a sky already going lavender at the edges. In the distance, behind the low roofs of town, the mountains rose up like a darker wall, their outlines sharp against the fading light. You'd hate the bed, but the air smells like pine, she wrote. I could almost hear the highway outside her door, the crunch of gravel under tires, the soft thump of someone closing a room door 2 units down. I typed back, "Check in with that beacon tomorrow, okay?" This time she didn't tease. "Yeah, I will," she replied. It was simple, but there was a softness in those 3 words that I felt more than read, like a hand briefly touching your shoulder in passing. That night, Denver felt quieter than usual. I turned off the TV early and let the apartment settle around me, the tick of the kitchen clock, the low hum of the fridge, the occasional whoosh of a car out on the main road. Cool air slipped through the gap in my bedroom window, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and distant rain, and I lay there in the half-dark with my phone on the nightstand screen, down, volume turned all the way up. It was a small thing, a private ritual I'd picked up over the years when she was in the mountains. I slept lighter, listening even in my dreams for the chime of a message coming through. Around midnight, I woke for no particular reason. The room dim, the street outside almost silent. I reached over, flipped the phone so the screen faced me, and watched it for a few long seconds, waiting for it to light up on its own. It didn't. The glass stayed black, reflecting only the faint outline of my face and the soft glow of the digital clock behind me as the quiet in the room settled into something just a little too deep. The morning Hannah was supposed to check in, I woke earlier than usual. The apartment was dim, the light soft and blue-gray the way it gets before the sun commits to rising. I reached for my phone before my feet even touched the floor, half expecting to see a message waiting there. Nothing. Just the blank glow of the lock screen reflecting the edges of my bedroom. I remember telling myself it didn't mean anything. She was probably still packing up at the motel, maybe grabbing coffee from that little gas station near the turnoff, the one with the burnt smell that clings to your clothes. But even as I tried to believe the easy explanations, there was a thin current humming low in my ribs, something I didn't have a name for yet. By 9, I was at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The morning traffic outside my building had thinned to a murmur, and somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's dog scratched at a door. I kept checking my phone in these short, compulsive bursts. Hit the button, stare at the screen. Let it go dark, then pick it up again as if the message might appear the moment I looked away. By noon, I finally sent her a text. Everything good. Nothing came back. I added ping the beacon when you can. Still nothing. I tried to steady myself. She'd had spotty service before. Some trailheads were dead zones for hours, and sometimes she got caught up shooting and forgot the time. But she never missed an entire check-in window. Not once. Around 2 in the afternoon, the sunlight shifted across my living room in a long, slow sweep, catching on the edges of picture frames and the metal bowl where I kept my keys. It should have been ordinary. It wasn't. I remember pacing from the kitchen to the balcony door, the air smelling faintly of rain, even though the sidewalks were bone dry. A bus hissed to a stop down on the street. Someone honked. A kid shouted. Life went on exactly as it always did, and I couldn't make myself feel part of it. I tried calling her, straight to voicemail. I left a second message, then a third, my voice getting tighter in ways I didn't recognize until I heard the playbacks afterward. By late afternoon, I'd opened my laptop and pulled up her route, the digital copy she'd emailed me, the printed version pinned behind my desk just 2 days earlier. The line she'd drawn cut cleanly along the ridge for miles, ending right back in Cedar Ridge before dark. She should have turned up at the motel. Frank Delaney, the owner, was the kind of man who sat behind the front desk with a radio playing old country songs low under his breath. I'd never met him, but I could picture him clearly, then keys hanging behind him on a pegboard, the smell of pine cleaner lingering in the air. I imagined him looking up as she walked through the glass door, brushing dust off her boots, smiling politely the way she did with strangers. The image wouldn't settle. It kept breaking apart before it reached the end. At 5, I finally called the Aspen Creek Motel myself. Frank answered on the second ring, his voice rough like he'd smoked for decades. I explained who I was, who she was, and asked if she'd checked out that morning or mentioned returning early. He didn't even pause. She hasn't been back, he said. Her room key hasn't moved from the peg. That was when my stomach dropped clean and hard like a stone hitting water. I thanked him and hung up, though I barely remember the words leaving my mouth. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed distant, as if the whole room had shifted a few inches to one side. Driving to Cedar Ridge wasn't a decision. It was a reflex. I grabbed my jacket and keys and was out the door before half the thoughts in my head had finished forming. The interstate stretched out in front of me in long, darkening lanes, the evening light flattening across the plains as the first stars began to show. The further west I drove, the sharper the air smelled pine dust, a trace of cold that slid through the cracked window and caught at the back of my throat. Every few miles, I tried her phone again. Every time, the same dead silence. The sky over the foothills was the color of steel wool when I passed the county line, and the last of the daylight clung weakly to the peaks like fading embers. Cedar Ridge was quiet when I arrived. It always was in early fall, but that night the silence felt different, thicker somehow, like the town didn't want to be overheard. The neon sign of the motel flickered at the edges as I pulled into the gravel lot, each pulse of red and blue light washing across the hood of my car. Frank was behind the counter just like I'd pictured him. He looked up when I came in, his eyes narrowing slightly, though not with suspicion, more like recognition of something he'd seen before. Men arriving after dark looking for someone who hadn't come back. "She's not in her room," he said before I could speak. I checked again. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. "Her car." He shook his head. "Not here." The radio behind him crackled softly, some old song drifting out like a memory too faded to name. He handed me the spare key to her room without being asked. I remember the smell when I opened the door. The sharpness of cold air trapped inside too long. A faint trace of her shampoo lavender and citrus hanging stubbornly in the stillness. The room looked exactly like she must have left it. Her notebook on the small desk, a wrapper from a granola bar in the trash. Her charger still coiled on the nightstand, plugged in, but unused. The bedspread pulled halfway back where she'd sat to lace her boots that morning. It should have been comforting seeing pieces of her laid out like that. It wasn't. It felt like stepping into a photograph taken half a second before something changed. I stood there with my hands hanging at my sides, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the faint shuffle of footsteps from the room next door. My chest tightened, a slow, gradual constriction like the air growing thinner. I tried calling her again, but hearing her voicemail greeting and that stale motel air made something sharp twist inside me. I ended the call before the beep. I went back to the front office. Frank was looking out toward the parking lot, his broad shoulders rounded, one hand resting on the counter like he needed it to steady himself. When he turned to me, his eyes were softer than before. "She talked to one of the rangers yesterday morning," he said. "Emily Hart. She might know something." He wrote down the number, sliding the paper across the counter with a kind of quiet care that made my throat go tight. I stepped back out into the night. The air smelled of dirt and diesel from the highway. A cold wind came down off the mountains, brushing against my face like a warning. Ranger Hart answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm but focused, the kind of voice people get when their job requires them to stay steady even when they're staring at trouble. She remembered Hannah, remembered the jacket, the camera strap, the questions about the best angle for the fall light. She headed toward Elk Shadow, she said. Told me she'd hiked tougher trails. She seemed confident. There was a pause. I heard paper being shuffled on her end, a chair creak. "She hasn't checked in with anyone," she said. "Not since yesterday morning." The words hit harder than I expected. I felt cold all the way down to my fingertips. "I'm going to look into it," she said quietly. "But for now, you should get some rest." I didn't rest. I drove to the trailhead instead. The dirt road leading up to it rattled my car so hard the glove compartment buzzed open, spilling maps onto the floor. The sky had gone fully dark, only the thin glow of my headlights cutting across the tall grass and the wooden sign marking the start of the trail. The air smelled of wet earth and the metallic tang that comes before a frost. I got out and stood there, the gravel shifting under my boots, the night pressing in around me like a closing hand. Her car wasn't there. It should have been the simplest detail, the one thing that might have reassured me. Maybe she'd turned around. Maybe she'd decided to try another trail. But the empty space where her car should have been made the dark feel heavier. The silence of the woods pressed close, a low, constant hush, like the breath of something sleeping just out of sight. I walked a few steps down the trail, my flashlight beam trembling across rocks and dried leaves, illuminating nothing but the narrow, worn path curving into the trees. Every sound felt amplified, the soft crunch under my shoes, the faint rustle of something small in the brush, the distant trickle of water. I tried to picture her walking this same path hours earlier, camera on her shoulder, her hair tucked into her collar to keep out the wind. The image slipped away too easily. By the time I got back to the motel, the parking lot was empty except for my car and an old pickup with fogged windows. The neon sign hummed overhead, casting a faint red sheen across the gravel. I sat in my car with the engine idling, staring out at the road, waiting for headlights that never appeared. The clock on the dashboard ticked past 10 past 11, then deeper into the night. I think I expected the phone to ring, expected her voice to cut through the dark and say she was fine, that she'd just taken longer on the trail. But the phone stayed silent on the passenger seat. When I finally stepped out of the car, the air was so cold it stung the inside of my nose. I stood there a long moment, hands in my pockets, looking toward the road that curved out of town and up into the dark shoulders of the mountains. Somewhere in that blackness was the trail she'd walked. Somewhere in there was an answer I wasn't ready to face. I didn't hear the sheriff's cruiser right away. Not until the tires crunched onto the gravel behind me. A door opened, closed softly. And when I turned, Sheriff Tom Ridley was standing there under the motel's flickering sign hat in his hands, the night air moving around us like a slow, uncertain tide. The sheriff's cruiser idled beside the motel office, long enough for the headlights to wash a pale arc across the gravel, then clicked off, leaving only the dim neon buzz behind me. Sheriff Ridley stepped out with his hat still in his hands, the brim brushing his coat, as if he already knew the night wasn't going to offer anything easy. The air smelled like cold dirt and exhaust, and somewhere beyond the last row of parked cars, a dog barked once and fell silent again. Ridley didn't waste words. He asked when I'd last heard from Hannah what she'd said about her route, whether she'd ever changed plans mid-trip before. I answered him piece by piece, watching his face in the shifting motel light. Each detail seemed to settle heavier on him than the last. By dawn, the gravel lot looked different. County trucks had rolled in one by one, their engines rattling in the chilled morning air. Red taillights glowed through a thin layer of mountain fog, and the smell of fuel mixed with the sharper scent of wet pine drifting down from the slopes. Deputies leaned over the beds of their trucks, hauling out radios, small first aid kits, and long coils of rope. A ranger unit pulled in just after sunrise, headlights cutting briefly across the line of trees before switching off. When Ranger Hart stepped out, her breath came out in thin white clouds, and she gave me a quiet nod before walking straight to the sheriff. There was no big announcement, no moment when someone declared an official start. It just happened, the slow shift from talk to motion. A deputy unfolded a map across the hood of a county SUV, smoothing the corners with his palms. Another unlocked a metal case in the back of his truck and let two search dogs out their paws, kicking up little bursts of dust as they padded around, sniffing the air. Someone else adjusted the volume on a handheld radio until static crackled through the morning quiet. It hit me all at once. This wasn't just me waiting for my sister to call back. This was something bigger, heavier, commanded by the kind of authority that only shows up when time is slipping and the stakes are rising. We caravanned to the trailhead a little after 7. The dirt road leading up to it felt rougher in the morning light, the deep ruts filled with a thin sheet of frozen mud that cracked under the tires. When the trucks parked, doors opened almost in unison. The air was sharp, the kind that tightens your lungs on the first breath. Aspen leaves, already half-turned, skittered across the road, catching on boots and tires. The dogs leapt out again, tails stiff with focus noses to the ground. Her car was right there, parked near the wooden sign that marked the beginning of the Elk Shadow route. Clean, locked, everything in its place. Seeing it should have meant relief. Instead, it felt like hitting an invisible wall. The windows were fogged lightly on the inside, a kind of frost forming at the edges, and her printed route map sat on the passenger seat exactly like it had in her apartment. The sheriff didn't open the doors right away. He just stood there for a long moment, gloved hand resting on the roof of the car, his breath coming out in slow, even clouds. The dogs circled the vehicle, then tugged toward the trail. When their handlers unclipped the leashes, they bounded ahead with that single-minded drive that search dogs have, noses sweeping the ground in tight arcs. The deputies followed in a staggered line, boots crunching over the hardening earth. The rest of us moved slower, more careful as the trail narrowed between cedar trunks and rock walls, slick with the previous week's rain. For the first quarter mile, we could see signs that someone had passed through, boot prints pressed into soft soil, the occasional scuffed patch of dirt where a hiker might have stepped off balance. Ranger Hart walked beside me for a while, her gaze fixed ahead, her voice low when she spoke. She told me that early fall was deceptive up here. Warm during the day, dangerous at night. That people tended to overestimate what 2 miles meant on a trail like this. Her tone wasn't accusing, just steady matter of fact. But each word sat differently in my gut, as if she was trying to prepare me for something without saying it outright. The dogs kept moving until we reached the stream. Meltwater rushed through it louder than I expected, as if the mountains were clearing their throat. The air there felt colder, the scent of wet stone and decaying leaves rising like steam. One dog paced in circles, nose low, confused. The other let out a short, frustrated bark. The handlers tried again, moving them up and down both banks, but the trail simply vanished. The sheriff muttered something under his breath. Nothing sharp, just a quiet acknowledgement that nature had taken the upper hand. A deputy pointed out something caught in the moss just beyond the water, a scrap of red mesh, maybe an inch wide. My heart lurched, but Ranger Hart crouched beside it and shook her head. "Tourist trinket," she said softly. "Could be months old, maybe years." The fabric was synthetic bright against the dark green ground, and for a split second I felt sure I'd seen it before. But memory is tricky when fear starts to crowd it. We moved past the creek deeper into the gorge where the trail thinned and the trees grew tighter. The ground was soft and silent, the kind that absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. The search dogs fanned out again but found nothing. No scent, no clothing, no snapped branches or disturbed stones. It felt impossibly clean, like the forest had swept itself before we arrived. By midday, the sheriff called for a regroup at a clearing just off the main trail. The sun filtered weakly through the canopy, turning the air into a muted gold. Deputies gathered around the hood of another truck where a second map was spread out, marked with red grease pencil lines and tiny numbered stickers. Their radios crackled with static and occasional updates: North Ridge clear, no sign near the East Bend negative on the creek bank. Each report landed like a small stone in my chest. Volunteers from town arrived, then farmers with weathered faces, a pair of local climbers carrying ropes looped over their shoulders, and a retired couple who'd been hiking these mountains for years. They asked gentle questions, not out of curiosity, but out of concern. What was she wearing? How much food did she bring? Did she usually wander off trail for photos? Their voices carried a softness, the kindness of people who'd seen mountains give and take in equal measure. The sheriff divided everyone into smaller teams. Some headed for the slopes above the gorge, others for the deeper sections of the shadow trail where the terrain was known to twist unexpectedly. I joined one of the volunteer groups climbing a steep rise where loose shale shifted under our boots. The air up there tasted like metal, and a thin wind cut across the ridge carrying the scent of sap and cold rock. We scanned every hollow and fallen log, every shadow that didn't quite match the ones around it. Around mid-afternoon, we found something that made all of us stop. A small depression in the dirt near the base of a pine, shaped vaguely like a footprint, but softened at the edges, almost blurred. For a moment my pulse kicked up, but Ranger Hart, who'd climbed up to meet us, shook her head after a closer look. "Too big," she said quietly. "Boot size isn't right." The volunteer beside me exhaled slowly, long enough for his breath to rise white in the cooling air. By 4 o'clock, I could feel the fatigue biting into my legs, the kind that creeps in after miles of uneven ground. The light had shifted again, growing thinner, stretched out across the rocks like a fading veil. Radios chirped checkpoints in calm voices, but beneath the calm was something else, an unspoken thread of worry. A deputy mentioned that it was getting cold fast. Someone else suggested checking the old hunting cabins scattered a few miles off the main routes. The sheriff agreed, marking them on the edge of the map with deliberate strokes. When we descended toward the main trail again, we passed through a narrow corridor of tall pines. The wind moved through them with a low, hollow sound, almost like a distant voice. I remember stopping for a second, closing my eyes, trying to hear anything familiar. Her laugh, her footsteps, the click of her camera shutter. But all that came was wind, the shifting creak of branches and the soft patter of loose needles falling onto the trail. Back at the base, the search continued in waves. Deputies walked out new directions, volunteers crossed old ones, and the dogs made another pass through the areas closest to the trailhead. The sheriff and Ranger Hart spoke quietly beside the vehicles, and even from a distance I could see the subtle tightness in their shoulders, the way their eyes kept drifting toward the map like they hoped it might rearrange itself and show something they'd missed. As the sun began to slip behind the ridge, Cedar Ridge grew colder. Long shadows stretched across the clearing, the evening light catching on bits of gravel and turning them into tiny sparks. I felt a heaviness settle across my chest. Not panic, exactly. Something slower, more grounded, like the realization that each hour without news was closing a door behind us. A pair of locals walked up with thermoses of coffee for the search teams. The smell drifted through the clearing, warm and familiar, but it only seemed to deepen the ache growing in my chest. One of them mentioned in a voice barely above a whisper that years back, a tourist had gone missing on a nearby ridge and was never found. Another muttered something about an old cabin that hikers used to talk about hidden miles off any marked trail. Rumors floated around us like fog, half memories, half myth, but each one tightened the air a little more. By early evening, radios began calling teams back in. The temperature had dropped sharply, and a pale frost crept over the rocks near the parking area. I saw deputies rubbing their hands together, breath rising in small clouds. Someone coughed. Someone else stretched out stiff legs beside a truck tire. The sheriff stood with his hands on his hips, eyes fixed on the darkening tree line as though he were waiting for it to tell him something. I leaned against my car, the metal cold through my jacket, and watched as the last bit of sun slipped behind the mountain, leaving the sky a deep blackening blue. The air smelled of diesel fumes and pine sap, a combination that somehow made the night feel even lonelier. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, and for one bright, foolish second my heart lurched, but it was just a weather alert warning of frost after sundown. Ranger Hart stepped toward the sheriff, then something small in her hand. She didn't lift it high, didn't say anything I could hear. Ridley took it from her and looked down at it for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw tightening just enough for me to notice. He glanced toward me, then back at the slender object resting in his palm. He didn't call out. He didn't motion me forward. He just stood there in the dimming light, the last of the day slipping away behind him, holding something I couldn't yet see but would soon have to. When Sheriff Ridley finally opened his hand, revealing the small object he and Ranger Hart had been studying, it was just a piece of information, coordinates written on a narrow slip of paper taken from a volunteer who thought he'd glimpsed something odd high on the north slope. But the sheriff's face told a different story. His eyes had gone still in that way seasoned men get when they're bracing for a turn they didn't want to take. The evening light was fading fast, settling over the trucks and map tables in a pale blue wash, and the cold had started to creep up from the ground. Something in me tightened before I understood why. It felt like the air around us shifted, like the mountains were holding their breath. Within minutes, radios crackled with a new urgency. Teams that had been preparing to close down for the night were redirected. Trucks rumbled to life, headlights slicing through the dimming woods. No one raised their voice or called attention to anything, but in the way the deputies moved, straighter backs, quicker steps, you could feel it. Something had finally broken loose from the quiet. I followed the sheriff's truck up a rough service road that twisted higher along the ridge. Dust rose behind our tires, hanging in the cold air like a pale veil. The sky above us was sliding from blue to charcoal, and a faint wind moved through the pines with a hollow, steady note. When we reached the narrow pull-off, the search crews had already gathered flashlights, cutting thin beams through the undergrowth, their breath rising like smoke in the fading light. Someone pointed toward a stretch of brush that dipped into a dense pocket of trees. The sheriff stepped in first boots, scraping against the rough soil. From where I stood, I couldn't yet see what they saw. Only the shift in their posture, shoulders, squaring lights angling downward told me that something waited beneath that cover of branches. A deputy called for the dogs again in a clipped voice, and when the animals reached the spot, both stopped at once. Their bodies stiffened. One let out a low whine, the kind that seems pulled from someplace old and instinctive. My heart thudded hard enough that the sound filled my ears. Ranger Hart stepped out from behind a cedar trunk and raised her arm, signaling for the rest of us to hold back. Her flashlight beam flicked across the earth, catching the edge of something wooden beneath a thick carpet of leaves. It looked worn, almost eaten by time, but it wasn't natural. It had straight lines, corners. A structure not large, not tall, just barely rising above the forest floor, half swallowed by brush. The deputies started clearing branches. The sheriff knelt and pushed his hand through the leaf litter, revealing the top of an old door frame set into the earth, the hinges rusted but recognizable. A cold draft leaked from the gap, carrying a smell that didn't belong to the forest, dry, stale, faintly metallic. My stomach rolled. The sheriff looked up briefly, meeting my eyes, then looked away as if he wished he didn't have to. They forced the door open with a slow groaning sound that echoed strangely through the trees. A beam of light shot inside, illuminating dust swirling in a long, still corridor of air. The space beyond was small, no more than a single room tucked under the slope, but it was enough to send a ripple through the search line. The first deputy stepped inside carefully, his boots tapping against the wooden floorboards. Another followed, then the sheriff. When Ranger Hart lifted her flashlight, the beam shook ever so slightly in her hand. Then I heard it, the soft, stunned exhale of a man who'd walked into something he'd only imagined in the worst corner of his mind. Tom. Ranger Hart's voice floated out thin and controlled, but there was an edge beneath it that made my legs feel unsteady. You need to see this. The sheriff didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, it was barely audible. Daniel, stay where you are. But I could already see shapes inside that dim room. A table in the middle, its surface cleared except for two plates arranged opposite each other, as if waiting for occupants. A pair of chairs, pushed up neatly, one angled slightly, as though someone had once sat there and risen without disturbing the order. The air inside was so dry it felt brittle, like it might shatter if touched. It smelled of old wood, and time stopped too long. And then, illuminated by the sheriff's light, I saw the jacket. Yellow, faded from the cold, but unmistakable. Hannah's jacket, draped over a still form seated at that table. My knees weakened. The trees around me blurred. Every sound, the scraping of boots, the whisper of wind, felt distant, muted, as if I'd stepped into a different layer of air. I don't remember moving. I only remember Ranger Hart stepping into my line of vision, blocking the doorway with both hands raised, her face carefully controlled. Daniel, she said softly, don't come closer. I heard her voice as if underwater. My breath caught somewhere high in my chest, and for a long, impossible moment, I felt nothing at all, no pain, no fear, just a hollow, ringing quiet. The world around me seemed to dim, every detail receding, except that single, awful spot of color inside the dark room. The room that felt more like a vault than a place where life had ever existed. Deputies moved around me, their movements purposeful but hushed. A perimeter was set up. Radios murmured with controlled urgency. Someone placed a hand on my shoulder, steady but gentle, guiding me back a few steps. The cold air stung my face, though I hardly felt it. Inside the structure, investigators photographed everything, each flash of the camera brightening the room for an instant before dropping it back into gloom. They found shelves lined with old supplies, water bottles arranged with labels facing outward canned food expired years before, but stacked in perfect rows. Dust lay thick on the wooden planks except for a narrow path of clean floor leading from the door to the table. A small vent in the roof had been built by hand, lined with makeshift ductwork that looked too deliberate to be accidental. A deputy reached under the bed and pulled out a backpack, Hannah's still zipped, still intact. No signs of struggle, no damage. Her camera bag sat beside it, but when they checked it, the memory card was missing. Eventually, the sheriff stepped back out. His shoulders lifted slightly as if they were carrying something far heavier than his coat. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't have to. I saw everything in the angle of his head, the tight line of his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, the tone of a man holding his words together, because he knew they mattered. "Daniel," he said quietly. "It looks like she was kept here for some time." The world tilted. The cold air cut deeper. My breath hitched as though my lungs couldn't expand fully. He continued explaining that the medical examiner would have to confirm details, but there were signs: dehydration, prolonged isolation, traces of medication found nearby. My heart pounded in a heavy, uneven rhythm. The sheriff's voice kept going, each word landing like a dull blow. They found footprints near the entrance, one set larger than Hannah's, pressed deep into the old earth. Not fresh, but clear enough to read. They found evidence of someone returning after she died, shutters closed from outside items arranged with deliberate order. And under a loose floorboard, they found something that made the investigators go silent for a long time: a battered gray laptop missing its main drive, but containing fragments of data stored deep in the machine's memory. Photos, notes, observations, not just of Hannah, of others. As details emerged over the next hours, the picture sharpened into something colder than I could have imagined. A man who had lived off-grid for years in the forests of Colorado and Montana, slipping between old logging sites and forgotten cabins. A man who had watched hikers from a distance long before approaching them. A man who had lost a sister in the mountains years earlier, a woman named Clara Hale, whose death had broken him in ways no one recognized at the time. The suspect's name, Lucas Hale, 27, surfaced from the fragments the investigators pieced together. The sheriff explained all this in the quietest voice I'd ever heard from him. The wind had stilled by then, and the cold pressed in around us like a wall. Someone offered me a blanket, but my body felt numb from the inside out, as if sensation had been drained before I even realized it. I watched deputies string tape around the clearing, the thin line catching the last of the fading light. Flashlights bobbed through the trees. A distant generator rumbled to life to power additional lights around the site. Every sound came through as if wrapped in cotton. Ranger Hart stood beside me for a long time without speaking. Her gloves were tucked under one arm, and her breath fogged the air in slow, steady bursts. At some point, she touched my elbow, not to guide me, just a small human gesture. I could feel the warmth of her hand even through my jacket. Somehow, that made everything sharper, more real. Eventually, the sheriff approached again, clearing his throat softly. "Daniel," he said, "we need you to come back down to the station when you're ready. There are some things we'll have to go over." His words hung there for a moment, suspended in the cold air between us. I nodded, though I barely felt my head move. Around us, the trees stood still, silent witnesses to something they would never repeat. As we walked back down the slope toward the vehicles, the forest felt different. Darker. Older, carrying a weight I hadn't sensed before. The path under my boots was firm, but each step felt strangely disconnected, as if I were walking in a dream I couldn't wake from. When we reached the clearing, someone was turning off the last of the portable lights, letting the night reclaim its shape. The sheriff waited by his cruiser, the red taillights glowing faintly in the deepening dusk. He opened the passenger door and stepped back, giving me space. Behind us, the ridge loomed black against the sky, and the cold wind stirred again, whispering through the branches, as if to say the mountain had finally given up its secrets. I slid into the seat and closed the door. The cruiser's interior smelled faintly of dust and old vinyl. The sheriff started the engine. The headlights cut a thin, trembling line through the dark. We drove down the slope in silence, the forest closing behind us, as if sealing the chapter we'd just opened. At the base of the mountain, a few more trucks waited, their engines idling, radios glowing like small embers in the dark. It would be a long night at the sheriff's office, and nothing in my life would ever return to what it had been before that door opened into the cold, still room on the mountain. In the hours after they brought me down from that mountainside, everything moved in a blur of cold air, fluorescent light, and voices speaking in careful tones. The sheriff's office smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner and the faint rubber scent of boots drying near the heater. Deputies moved through the hallway with a quiet purpose, their radios murmuring faint updates that didn't seem to belong to any world I recognized. I sat at a small table with a paper cup in my hands, the coffee inside cooling untouched. My fingers shook in tiny involuntary twitches, as if my body was still trying to find footing after slipping off some unseen ledge. At one point, Sheriff Ridley eased into the chair across from me, his coat draped over the back damp from the mountain air. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He just waited until I was steady enough to hear what came next. They told me the cabin was secured through the night, guarded by deputies who would rotate in shifts until the forensic team could arrive at first light. They told me that the state medical examiner was already on the road. They told me a larger investigation would be opened the moment the preliminary files crossed the right desk. I remember nodding, though the words felt distant, almost muffled. When they finally asked who they could call for me, I realized I'd been avoiding the answer. I stepped outside into the parking lot, the cold hitting my face like a quiet slap, and called my parents. My mother didn't say a word for the first few seconds after I told her. When her voice finally came, it sounded thin, stretched tight enough to break. My father tried to ask questions, but they kept dissolving halfway out of him, and I could hear him walking through the house, opening and closing doors like he was looking for something he'd misplaced. I told them I'd stay close to the station until the morning, then come back to Denver. I don't remember the drive to the motel. I only remember the stillness of the room when I closed the door, the way the heater clicked, then clicked again, pushing warm air into a space that felt colder than the ridge ever had. Over the next few days, investigators moved quickly. They brought in specialists from Denver and the federal office in Aurora. They studied the prints outside the cabin, cataloged every can and water bottle, photographed each item in its place. The medical examiner's report came back with phrases that cut like dull blades: severe dehydration, extended confinement, sedatives present in her system. None of it dulled the truth, and none of it softened the blow. When they analyzed the laptop, it revealed what the sheriff had feared, but wouldn't say out loud: that first night Hannah hadn't been a random victim. She had been chosen, observed, tracked long before she ever set foot in Cedar Ridge. Once the suspect's name surfaced, Lucas Hale, the younger brother of a woman who had died in Montana years earlier. The investigation widened across state lines. Hale had been living off the grid for nearly a decade, drifting through forest land in patterns no one recognized until the digital trail pulled it into the light. Federal agents finally located him weeks after Hannah's discovery, not far from another trail system in northern Colorado. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply walked out of a stand of pines with his hands raised, as though the searchers had interrupted him in the middle of some silent ritual he was prepared to repeat forever. The trial took more than a year. It was held in a courthouse with high ceilings and cold marble floors, a place where every footstep sounded louder than it should. I sat through hearings where experts spoke calmly about psychological patterns and behavioral fixation. I listened as prosecutors laid out evidence collected from cabins, storage caches, and journals recovered from Hale's campsites. Each word felt like it pressed deeper into my chest. But I stayed. My parents stayed. Ranger Hart testified with a steady voice, though her hands trembled when she stepped down from the stand. Sheriff Ridley kept his hat in his lap through the entire proceeding, turning it slowly between his palms during breaks, like he was grounding himself in the weight of something familiar. When the verdict came multiple life sentences without parole, the courtroom didn't erupt or sigh or collapse. It just settled. A long, heavy exhale of a room that had held its breath too long. Hale kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, unmoved by the words sealing his fate. I realized then that justice, as the law defined it, was only part of what people mean when they use the word. It could hold a man accountable. It could close a courtroom. But it couldn't reach backward into the woods and change what had happened in that hidden room. Cedar Ridge changed after that. For months, hikers avoided the Elk Shadow Trail. Locals who'd once spoken freely about old forest stories now lowered their voices, glancing toward the mountains before continuing. The sheriff's office added new protocols for reporting lone hikers, and a small memorial was placed near the base of the trail. A simple wooden sign carved with initials that wind and snow began smoothing almost immediately. Ranger Hart left a pair of tiny pine cone carvings at the site every fall, each one made by her father when she was a child. She never mentioned it, but I saw them once and knew they were hers. Back in Denver, my routines shifted in ways I didn't expect. I started leaving my phone volume on high even when I slept. I found myself turning on the living room lamp in the early mornings, unable to sit in the half-dark the way I used to. I kept one of Hannah's framed prints on my kitchen counter, gold aspens, against a deep blue sky taken somewhere along the Continental Divide. Sometimes when the light hits it at a certain angle, it glows faintly, and for a moment it feels like she's still out there chasing color on some ridge I haven't learned the name of. My parents visit more often now. We sit together longer, talk slower. My mother touches the photo on my counter every time she walks past it, almost like greeting someone. My father has grown quieter, carrying his grief in a way that shows up most in the gentleness of his voice. There are meals where we barely speak at all, just sit in the presence of one another, letting the silence say what our words can't manage. As for me, time hasn't sharpened the memory of that cabin. It's softened it in some places, blurred edges that once cut sharply. But there are details that remain painfully clear. The angle of the chair, the way the air smelled dry and old, the quiet that felt too deliberate to be natural. I still think about all the days she sat alone in that dim space, waiting for something none of us could have imagined. And every autumn, when the first leaves turn gold in the foothills, a part of me feels both drawn and held back, like the season itself carries a weight I can't ignore. Some stories you don't get to set down. You just learn to carry them without letting them break you. I've learned to find moments of peace in unexpected places, an early morning walk when the air is cool enough to sting the sound of wind moving through tall grass, the soft hum of traffic drifting up from the street below my apartment. Small things, but steady ones. Things that remind me the world still holds beauty, even after it's shown you its darkest corners. There's one image that lingers more than the rest. It isn't the cabin or the trial or even the moment I learned she was gone. It's a memory from years before of watching Hannah lift her camera toward a band of light breaking between storm clouds. The air had smelled like wet earth. The wind had moved her hair just slightly across her cheek. She'd smiled at nothing in particular, steadying the shot completely alive in that single bright moment. I hold on to that, her last untouched place in my mind, because it reminds me who she was long before the mountain took her into its silence. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.